Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kent Lassman, the president at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Thank you for joining us for another policy discussion in our series, Repeal for Resilience. Throughout the year, we've been highlighting rules, regulations, and laws that stand in the way of an effective response to the pandemic and hold us back from economic recovery. Modestly, I'd offer that many of these laws were never needed in the first place. And today we've got a little bit of everything for you. We'll talk about a failed policy that flows from the Jones Act, a law that has produced negative outcomes in areas as wide-ranging as national security, energy, and shipping for 100 years. It's legislation that requires any ship traveling between 2 points in the United States to be U.S. manufactured, owned, flagged, and crewed. It's protectionism and self-defeating. In moments, I'll be joined by two stellar guests. First, we'll hear from Senator Mike Lee, a Republican from Utah and a leading constitutionalist in the Congress. It's not the first time we've partnered with him, and I'm happy to have him back to discuss the Jones Act, what he's learned from colleagues in light of the multiple efforts he's made to reform the Jones Act legislatively, and what he might see as a path forward. Following remarks and some discussion with Senator Lee, I'll bring my colleague Mario Loyola into the conversation. Mario is a senior fellow with CEI and the author of a June issue analysis called America Last, the Grim Reality of the Jones Act. The paper, as well as all of Mario's work, is available at our website, cei.org. And as a quick reminder, if you'd like to take part in the conversation, please use the Q&A button found at the bottom of your monitor. The questions will be put in a queue, and I'll pass on as many of them as possible to our guest as we go. So Senator Lee, I want to say welcome. Thank you for making time today. I don't want to stand on ceremony and make this introduction any longer. You know that CEI is at the center of regulatory analysis and deregulatory advocacy. Our viewers are interested in your work on the Jones Act. I've heard that you suggest we should celebrate its centennial with a dumpster fire. So let's dive right in. Are your colleagues ready for repeal?
They're not, but they should be. We hope to get them there. And I applaud each of you for your work in this area. You know, most people, when they want to scare their kids at Halloween, will dress up as a monster. When I was a young father, I would dress up as the Code of Federal Regulations just to scare my children. And they understood and understand still today, federal regulations are at the heart of what's truly scary in our world. Now, intuitively, we know that the Jones Act creates a lot of costs. It's not just to our economy, but it's to U.S. families, hardworking moms and dads, poor and middle-class Americans all over the place. This is one of the things that happens when we artificially protect shipping industries from competition. Just like you do in any field, you're going to take those protected enterprises and you're going to cause market distortions that don't create the most efficient market-based prices. We know this to be true because over the just over 100-year history of the Jones Act, while we haven't had a lot of data published regarding the costs associated with the Act, we know intuitively that it's wrong, and what studies have been done confirm that there are some serious problems with it. We've got some estimates and some data that have been published that help give us an idea of the costs, both the direct and indirect costs associated with the Jones Act. For instance, the Grassroots Institute of Hawaii, an entity that I've grown fond of, based in part on their great love of hating the Jones Act, and their acknowledgement of how this hurts poor and middle-class Hawaiians in particular. Fairly recently issued a report on the Jones Act and acknowledged that there is a significant cost specifically to the state of Hawaii. What we know is that it costs the state of Hawaii's economy something like $1.2 billion annually. And that for the average family in Hawaii, it costs an additional roughly $800 a year just to live there, just as a result of higher prices attributable to the Jones Act. In 2002, the U.S. International Trade Commission noted that for each dollar gained by U.S. shipbuilders, carriers, and seamen from excluding competition from foreign flag ships, the American consumer loses more than $1. And so just like so many other federal regulations, so many other federal intrusions into the market economy, when this happens, it produces real inefficiency. And it doesn't just impose a cost on big blue chip wealthy Americans. In fact, it typically doesn't do that. It enriches a number of people at the expense of everyone else. And in that respect, the Jones Act is emblematic of the problem that arises from concentrated benefits and dispersed costs associated with excessive government regulation into the economy. There are a small handful of people made really rich by this law, but everybody else, especially people living in coastal or outlying areas, gets made just a little bit poorer as a result of it. That's immoral and it's wrong.
Well, we have our first question from the audience right on that point. So I'd like to ask you to follow up on that. Tony asks straight out of the gate, since there are so few companies and interests who benefit from the Jones Act, how is it that they mount such an effective lobbying campaign, to keep it in place as the evidence mounts? One might think that your colleagues would see the evidence, see an alternative, and move forward. But it looks like there are very successful lobbying campaigns at work.
Yeah, there are, and you're right. They sort of work together in order to create almost an ironclad barrier around it. But because there are a number of people who were made very wealthy by this, they've decided to band together and rely on the magic formula of fear, uncertainty, and doubt. Their favorite line is to say that if we lose our shipbuilding capacity and our capacity to assemble crews to run US flagged vessels, that it'll be chaos, it'll be anarchy, and that if we don't have the Jones Act, we will lose our ability to do those things. I understand the concern, but it's really not that different than related concerns on the manufacturing of all sorts of things. The fact is, we live in a pretty integrated economy in the world. I don't think it's fair to say that the American shipbuilding industry is suddenly going to disappear. In fact, it's mathematically impossible that that would happen if this occurred. Just when you look at defense spending alone and some of the requirements that go along with our defense spending arrangements, that literally wouldn't happen. What we want is simply for there to be an opportunity for others to compete. Back to the question of how they remain successful. I think the biggest way they remain successful is that even though this costs a lot of people a lot of money, it's in relatively small increments. And there's no breakdown when you purchase something, saying, here's how much more you paid for this because of the Jones Act. There's a transparency problem with the price tag attached to the law itself. And as much as anything, it's been around a long time. And so they also use reliance interests as a justification for maintaining it. There are people who have come to me within the industries that benefit from this, who've said, you can't take this away. And I'll ask why. And they'll say, well, because it's been around for 100 years. And because we've relied on it. I actually had one shipping company come to me and say, we've invested all this money in these ships, and the value of those ships will go down if you get rid of the Jones Act. To which I respond, well, are we supposed to just leave it that way in perpetuity? Even if it means that poor Americans are made poorer by this? I don't think so. So the biggest impediment really to achieving success in either a repeal or reform of the Jones Act is ignorance. And that's where I hope you and I can work together on this to make more members of Congress and more American citizens aware of the problems associated with it.
Mario, before we move off of the lobbying nexus, this concentrated benefits and distributed costs, did you want to add something? I think I saw your finger go up.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, and first of all, just to add to Senator Lee's excellent last point, Milton Friedman, and it's moving to think that in this country we used to have people like Milton Friedman appearing on Saturday afternoon talk shows. But anyway, Milton Friedman used to say that we are all more interested in our role as a producer of one thing than in our role as a consumer of 1,001 things. And that gets to the point of that Senator Lee just made. We have programs like the Sugar Program, the Jones Act, all these special interest rackets that are set up, and Americans get cut by them in small ways 1,000 times a day, and they just don't realize it. And so the real challenge in Congress is to raise public awareness, because these concentrated special interest lobbies walk into members' offices and they don't have anybody arguing against them. And so in the Jones Act, however, I mean, the Jones Act is subject to all the criticisms you can make of a protectionist measure, but it's also a very poorly designed protectionist measure, because it really hurts the intended beneficiaries in a lot of ways. And in particular, it has hurt the ocean-going sector. And so I would say one thing to note about the reforms that we've proposed, that Senator Lee has proposed, is that they affect a very small part of the Jones Act fleet, which is the ocean-going one, the one where ships are going from California to Hawaii, from Florida and New York to Puerto Rico, and crucially from the Gulf Coast to our refineries on the northeast, in the Northeast United States. So that ocean-going part of the Jones Act fleet, which is only less than 100 vessels, the Jones Act has already wiped out the entire ocean-going shipbuilding industry in the United States. So there's no shipbuilding industry left to protect outside of the defense establishment, is all we're talking about here. And meanwhile, on the inland waterways and Great Lakes, we have more than 30,000 tugs and barges that are the main Jones Act fleet. And that's where the law really gets its lobbying power. And so, you know, all of these special interest lobbies defend their perks tooth and nail. And that's why the, you know, large part of the inland waterway Jones Act fleet, their lobbyists will not abide even a small change that would affect the ocean-going part of the fleet, because they think that if they allow any reform, it'll end up with a broad repeal. But that's the problem that we have here, is that we have an extremely concentrated lobby that's defending one tiny sector that it has essentially poisoned to death. And we just have to raise awareness about the fact of how many costs it imposes on Americans, that not that we're protecting this ocean-going trade, ocean-going transport from foreign competition, but that we've essentially shut it down completely, almost completely.
So Senator Lee, let me see if I can link this together with our next question. It comes from Alan. Alan is up in New York. He notes, I've been unwittingly contributing to fine-sounding candidates for office who have been supporting the Jones Act. Is there a way to find these bad guys? And I might flip that on its head and ask you, so you've put legislation out. You've gone around to colleagues and asked them to put their name on it. And it's been, as Mario just outlined, good reform, but modest. It doesn't tackle every aspect of the Jones Act. Where is the support, and where are the reasonable lawmakers on this? Are they rallying to the flag, or ducking and hiding from you in the hallways there on Capitol Hill?
Unfortunately, with most of them, it's neither. So you've got a small handful who are saluting the Jones Act flag and worshiping the false idol god that is the Jones Act. But you've got a large number of others who just find it really boring. There's a good way to ruin a party, or a good way to kill a good conversation, is bringing up the Jones Act. I've found various interesting ways of bringing up into conversations when people least expect it. But it requires some creativity, and that's the biggest impediment to doing that. And you know, I've got several pieces of legislation, one that attacks it directly head on and would just undo it. That's called the Open America's Waters Act. That's the more aggressive version, but the narrower version is indicative of the broader problem in the way they respond to it. You know, my other bill, the Protecting Access to American Products Act, simply creates a Jones Act waiver. And So the waiver is a good policy because, we can still push for repeal. I wanted to find some other targeted avenues to address some of the worst consequences of the law without dying only on the hill of full repeal. One of the most unfortunate circumstances that we face as a result of the Jones Act is that places like Massachusetts and Puerto Rico have had to import liquefied natural gas from Russia because of the world's 478 LNG carriers. None, not one happens to comply with the Jones Act requirements. And so it's shocking that while the United States is currently experiencing the largest LNG boom in our nation's history, and for the first time ever in 60 years, we're a net exporter of LNG. It's illegal to use an LNG carrier to send LNG to our own states and territories. Puerto Rico has also imported jet fuel from Venezuela for similar reasons. And so that's what pushed me to address this concern by introducing this legislation I referred to a moment ago, the Protecting Access to American Products Act. And it would allow a person to receive a Jones Act waiver if, one, there's no Jones Act compliant vessel available to carry a particular good, and two, the person requesting the waiver can verify having made a good faith effort to locate a Jones Act compliant vessel. We know in many circumstances, there simply are no ships available to carry these goods. I'm not getting emotional. I just lost my voice momentarily. I should be getting emotional about it though, because it's a deep topic. So this approach through this bill has been a more effective way of getting more of my colleagues on board with it. Because when I brought this up in committee, when I've raised it at committee hearings or at Senate GOP conference discussions, I raised this example and this legislation, the Protecting Access to American Products Act. Nobody wants to defend that. Nobody wants to defend the aspect of the Jones Act that's requiring us to buy our jet fuel from Venezuela and Russia if you're Puerto Rico, or even just LNG from Russia if you're Massachusetts. Nobody wants to defend that. That's where we're starting to gain some momentum because people are realizing how silly the whole thing is. So the more we can get them talking about the absurd applications in these areas where it really does us no good, no one can make a credible policy argument that it's going to usher in Armageddon if we simply allow for a waiver in an instance where there is no Jones Act compliant vessel to begin with, and where we're otherwise going to have to buy stuff from our geopolitical adversaries as a result. So anyway, if you can help me get the word out on that, that would be very helpful. But these guys do not defend it on that basis. When I raise arguments like this, they instead either go silent, which is what we want, meaning the big defenders, the idolaters of the Jones Act, will go kind of quiet, and those who are on the fence will sort of change the subject. But the idolaters of the Jones Act, in private conversations about this, will default back to, yeah, I understand your policy is not a bad one, but we can't afford to send the signal that we're going to duck away from any component of the Jones Act. That's where we expose them. That's where we win.
Taking on this idea of waivers, we've seen over and over again in times of humanitarian need, most recently with Puerto Rico. You have a devastating natural event, a hurricane comes through, and a waiver will be issued almost immediately so that we can get goods, food, electric replacement parts for the electric grid, medical supplies. Is there an opportunity to push the idea of an economic recovery in the wake of the coronavirus is a long-standing humanitarian need, and we could have a permit or a 10-year waiver?
I think so, and there are some um, emergency authorities built into the law already that can allow the president to issue a certain waiver for a period of time in the wake of an emergency. I've raised this argument with the president and with the White House, and I'm hoping they will act on that front. There are, as you might imagine, just as there are in the Congress, there are within the White House some people who are vehement defenders of the Jones Act, and so they're leery of that for the same reasons that we're excited about that. But every time an emergency happens, every time there is a humanitarian crisis that emerges, we see the impact of this. And you don't need to go farther than the entity within the federal government that is sort of chiefly responsible for humanitarian relief aid. The U.S. Agency for International Development has itself acknowledged that they are able to provide less food aid, less assistance for people going through a humanitarian crisis as a result of the Jones Act. So that's how we win. We get them focused on tangible problems like that. We find exceptions. We get the camel's nose into the tent.
Now, Mario, it seems that you took aim squarely at some of those voices in the White House with even the title of your analysis last month, America Last. The idea that we're really, if we're going to do protectionism, we ought to do it well. And this is a poorly designed protectionist proposal because it simply protects foreign flagged vessels and foreign competitors. What sort of response have you seen to that argument?
I'll say, I'm trying to, thank you for noticing that. I'm trying to choose all of my titles that way. My last one on the national security aspects of the Jones Act was called, I think, The Deep End of the Swamp, because if we're talking about the swamp, I mean, I see the swamp as all of these special interest rackets that buy our otherwise honorable representatives and buy them off and get them to pick the special interests and provide special benefits for these special interests that come at the expense of the public interest, right? The public interest is the treasury against which all of these government-created cartels are charged, so to speak. It's the budget. It's the off-budget budget, where people get taxed without representation and without them even knowing it, and the benefits go to campaign contributors. It's a terrible racket. And when I was in the White House, I will tell you that I was privy to, I mean, I don't speak out of turn. I served I think it's very important to serve loyally when one is on any kind of a government staff. But there was a lot of movement, especially in connection with, for example, Puerto Rico recovery, to take a close look at the Jones Act. And I can tell you that in almost all of the components of the White House, from Council of Economic Advisors, National Economic Council, National Security Council, there was a very broad-based consensus on the deep-seated problems of the Jones Act. But if anybody who's familiar with the staff secretary process in the White House, which is similar to the interagency process across the federal government generally, it's very easy for one single component to block, to ask for deletions of material that gets put into a paper. And I'm perfectly happy to name names here, because in this, as in many other situations where the components of the White House were proposing meritorious things to the president, it was Peter Navarro blocking it. And it was Peter Navarro making sure that these things didn't go forward to the president, and making sure that sound analysis was struck from the papers going up to the president. But the good news there is that when it's essentially one person in the White House against all the other components of the White House, in the most protectionist-friendly administration that we've had in quite some time, it could be that the Jones Act, the staying power of the Jones Act is more apparent than real. And that's why raising awareness at this critical time could really have an effect. That's why I personally am trying to just attack all along the front, like Ridgeway in North Korea. I mean, that's the image I have in my mind. It's just keep attacking, because reform of the Jones Act is totally inevitable. The benefits are a pittance compared to the costs it imposes across the economy. Reform is inevitable, and it's only a matter of time before it comes.
Senator Lee, I want to pick up on something you had referenced, but it's very important for getting to the deal, getting to public support from some of your colleagues. you mentioned reliance interests and how you have folks come to you or come to colleagues like the union who would represent mariners. What is it you can say to them, right? We know it's not always good politics to just say, well, tough luck. You know, you had a 100-year ride. It's time to get off and pay your own freight. What is it you can say to help bring along people that are taking those concerns so very seriously?
My proposal is not about austerity, it's about prosperity. If you want something to benefit American jobs, if you want something to benefit even those who are unionized and working aboard American flagged ships, you should want the American economy to do well. You should want to increase trade and commerce within the United States and with foreign nations. There's one thing that would do that. It's regulatory reform, and it's the repeal of the Jones Act, at least that portion of the Jones Act that deals with vessels on the high seas.
One argument I've seen come up really just in the last couple of years, I think it's a note on our times, not so much a note on the Jones Act, is that by modernizing it or repealing it, which I would favor, we're opening the door to Chinese ships plying American waterways up and down the American coasts and lakes and rivers. And really, we're just doing a favor to the Chinese. How do you respond to that? I find it somewhat species, but want to know how a lawmaker such as yourself takes that on.
Look, first of all, if the Chinese are foolish enough to want to subsidize transportation within the United States, perhaps we ought to take that and run them into bankruptcy even faster. But I don't regard the argument as terribly plausible that all of a sudden you get rid of the Jones Act and every vessel in the United States is going to be Chinese flagged and Chinese crewed and Chinese built. It just doesn't stand to reason. From our common experience, we know that that's not the case. The Chinese competitors, regardless of how well funded they are always going to be outnumbered, and they're always going to be in some ways inferior to those that we can locate here in the United States. In any event, we want to be able to compete. If we insulate ourselves with our giant economic footprint in the world, if we insulate ourselves and American companies from competition from abroad, the surest fire way to lose American jobs in the long run. We don't want to do that.
I see your staff is sneaking into the back of the room, which is my signal that you've got about 90 seconds left. I'm going to come back to this topic about the future of the fleet on American waters with Mario in a moment. But is there any final words you have that you wanted to wrap up? And I will say thank you, because I know you're going to have to log off here. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll have this on YouTube later this afternoon. Senator Lee, your final comments? Yeah,
thanks so much. And thanks for all you do to educate the American people about this. I'm going to continue to do my best. And I'm very grateful to have you as a partner and as an ally in this. This is a battle we can win. In Washington, you tend not to see monuments built to people who take down laws. You don't see history books written about people.
Not yet. We're working on that.
But regardless, the reward is the benefit itself that's brought about to society. This is something that we've got to do. And so you have people here in Washington who are tripping over each other in order to get to the next spending bill, to attach the next big spending program, to create this or that new government agency. We can approach this project of getting rid of the Jones Act with the same kind of zeal that others approach spending more money. We can find the right moment for this. In the meantime, we're going to keep chipping away at it, because that's the only way we find that moment, is by trying every time we get a chance. Every time there's a window of opportunity with a humanitarian situation overseas, or with liquid natural gas having to be shipped from Russia to Massachusetts, or with jet fuel having to be shipped from Venezuela to Puerto Rico. Every time these developments occur, we need to shout them from the rooftops and find the nearest legislative vehicle to attach these reforms to. We can fight them anywhere, everywhere, but we need to fight them every single day. Sooner or later, we will find that weak link in the fence. We'll get through, and we'll bring about reform.
Thank you very much, Senator. Senator Mike Lee, Senior Senator of Utah, is joining us on the Jones Act.
Thank you, Senator.
Mario, let's rewind the tape. This notion of Chinese ships and Chinese crews would just swarm American waterways if we were to repeal this protection. Any merit there? Anything at all that we can take seriously about that argument?
Yeah, the argument is wrong at multiple levels. First of all, as we mentioned a moment ago, the reforms that we're talking about and that we're concentrating on would focus on the ocean-going part of the Jones Act fleet. And ocean-going transport it has been shut down. There's a lot of coastal trade, a lot of coastal traffic that would be occurring that isn't occurring at all because of the Jones Act fleet. And if a foreign ship wants to come in and offer to take oil from Texas to refineries in New England, instead of us having to pay for that same ship to take it to a refinery in Canada, then I don't see how anybody could object. I don't see how any American would have a reason to object to that. In fact, Americans should be happy about that. Now, the other objection is that the other way in which it's wrong is that in all of these, with respect to all of these kind of protectionist measures, people always argue that, well, labor costs are lower in China. And it's true. With respect to all kinds of transportation, they're significantly lower in China. But what people always forget is that the American worker is the most productive worker in the world. The American worker does in 1 hour what it takes workers in China 10 hours to do. And so that's why the labor cost differential is very misleading. And the perfect example of that is an industry that is totally unregulated, which is airline manufacturing, right? Airline manufacturing has essentially no protections. And Boeing is the world's leading manufacturer of aircraft. There's no reason why it wouldn't be the leading manufacturer, why Americans couldn't be the leading manufacturer of vessels. So Boeing, people don't know that 80% of the world's air freight packages that get delivered by air, people don't know that 80% of the world's air freight moves on Boeing aircraft, including in China. China is actually one of the biggest customers of Boeing aircraft. And that's what happens when you have an even playing field. There's no reason to think that wouldn't also happen here. Japan, by the way, was cleaning our clock during the 1980s when it came to the manufacture of seaborne vessels at a time when Japanese labor costs were actually higher than labor costs in the United States, if you can believe that. So these arguments are wrong at multiple levels. There's no reason why opening up the coastal trade to competition would lead to Chinese ships plying our inland waterways. That's not the part of the Jones Act that we are talking about. And so the arguments are wrong at multiple levels, and we just have to, the Jones Act lobby has a small collection of talking points. All of them are false. All of them are demonstrably false. And whenever one of them pops its head up, we just have to hammer it with the facts that are necessary to educate the public. And here, this is just another example.
So we have a clarification question for you about your analysis and the proposal you have in your paper. Peter asks if you would propose for the Jones Act to remain in effect for inland traffic, such as on the Great Lakes, where we would have Canadian carriers potentially plying those waters.
I would be in favor of removing the Jones Act.
Mario, I believe you just went on mute.
Sorry. I would be in favor of removing the Jones Act entirely. I don't think it helps anybody at all. But the one that's in the part of the Jones Act that's in most desperate need of reform is the one that has essentially ruined the ocean-going shipbuilding industry and that has shut down the ocean-going coastal trade. So that's why we are focused on at least getting that kind of a reform, and that's why the waiver vehicle. I mean, at this point, any reform of the Jones Act at all would be a great victory, because being able to exempt Puerto Rico from it, for example, would open up just that waiver alone. If we could get a long-term waiver, would open up a market of 3 million American citizens for oil producers and gas producers in Texas to be able to ship to, instead of scouring the world for export markets at a time of historically low oil prices, with many of the producers in West Texas facing bankruptcy, while the Jones Act forces Puerto Ricans to import their gas from Trinidad and get their oil from Nigeria and God knows where else. And again, this is just one more example among many where the protectionism of the Jones Act does not protect anybody in America. It protects foreign competitors of the United States. It's not even really correct to refer to this as a protectionist measure if the protectionism only inures to the benefit of foreign competitors. It's the opposite.
I want to get down in the weeds for just a moment on these big complex issues. It's one of my favorite places to go. So I hope you could explain for everybody and walk us through what does it mean to ship from between 2 points, 2 U.S. points, and how does that affect offshore equipment and offshore facilities? And in particular, I'm thinking of the discussion about wind turbines. And you have to walk us through a couple steps here, but tell us how the Jones Act affects something that really has nothing to do with shipping. It's really a green, renewable energy program. What are the downstream effects of this law in that way?
Well, so the Jones Act was originally written, I mean, the cabotage laws were originally written to refer to ports, so as to make it illegal for a foreign ship to travel between 2 United States ports. But people soon started getting around that by using things other than ports, such as anchoring just offshore. And so the law was rewritten to refer to U.S. points. And so U.S. points, according to federal regulators, can include a large tanker that is anchored 2 miles offshore, so that which is a practice called lightering. So that when the large tanker, a large foreign tanker bringing oil into the United States, unloads to a smaller tanker, so that the smaller tanker can come into a harbor and unload its cargo of oil, that smaller vessel has to be Jones Act compliant because it's traveling between 2 U.S. points. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. It's truly incredible. The wind turbine situation is obviously at CEI. We're no fans of wind energy, but the ships that are required to install wind turbines on the continental shelf 10 and 20 miles out to sea are highly specialized, as you can imagine. As is the case with LNG transport vessels, none of those specialized vehicles for installation of wind towers are made in the United States. So even though the United States leads the world in the manufacturing of wind turbines and wind turbine blades, when we're installing a wind farm out to sea, we have to use, in order to avoid violating the Jones Act, we have to use installation vehicles that are coming, not just foreign installation vehicles, but those foreign installation vehicles can't operate from American ports. They have to be operating from foreign ports because of the Jones Act. So now that they're operating from foreign ports, we also end up, it's also more economical to get the wind turbines and the equipment from those foreign countries. So here's yet another example where the Jones Act is enormously beneficial to America's foreign competitors, because it forces people who are installing wind farms out to sea to use foreign vessels, to use foreign turbines, to use foreign blades, when Americans could compete in all of these sectors.
Let's talk for a moment about the the effects of where the bill came from and the effects on national security and preparedness. We have a question from Stuart about the U.S. Navy supporting the act. Why would that be the case? The bill came on the heels of World War I. Where are we with the military transport and the capacity to ship what we need to ship across the world's oceans? And how does the Jones Act interact there?
Yeah, first of all, let me say that it's not that clear. I have no doubts that if the agency that manages the Jones Act fleet, or that manages the Merchant Marines national security programs, which is the Maritime Administration, it's part of the Department of Transportation. If that Maritime Administration were part of the Department of Defense, my firm belief, having worked at the Pentagon, is that the Jones Act would have been repealed already. It would have been repealed under Rumsfeld, because it's in contradiction to the strategic framework with which the U.S. approaches naval strategy and naval disposition of forces now since the Reagan administration, which is towards more specialization and more control of the transport assets that the Navy needs to move both its own stuff and the Army stuff and the Air Force's stuff. And so what happens is that so you have the Merchant Marine, which was useful after World War I, and during World War II, it performed admirable service and suffered heavy casualties in transporting men and materiel to Europe. But then the military utility of the Merchant Marine started diminishing after that. And in 1976, the United States created the Ready Reserve Fleet, which is a fleet of mostly foreign-built transport vehicles that are maintained by the U.S. government. And then in the 1980s, in the course of the 1980s and into the 1990s, the United States embraced strategic sea lift as a core naval function. And the idea was to be able to project power rapidly to points all around the globe. And for that, we needed a fleet that could be ready to sail at a moment's notice within 24 hours or 36 hours, 72 hours, a fleet that is of ships that can't assume that they're going to have deep harbors to operate in, that might have to unload their cargo in shallow waters. Therefore, they have to be able to operate tactically in shallow waters. They might be going into what are called impermissive hostile environments, which means that they have to be armored. So you're talking about ships that are increasingly small, fast, heavily armored, heavily specialized, specially engineered, at a time when the design of transport vessels, of commercial container transport vessels and commercial tanker vessels, is going in exactly the opposite direction, where these ships are getting much, much bigger. They're getting much, much slower. They're getting much, much more less maneuverable. And now there are very few container vessels, increasingly, and very few, none of these super tankers certainly are capable of harbor navigation, which means that they have to arrive in the general area and then unload onto smaller transports. And all of this takes a very long time. Long story short, in the Gulf War, all of this was shown sort of in Technicolor. We were supposed to have a lot of ships available for use in the Gulf War, but instead of activating the Merchant Marine, which would have taken a very long time, even though we had 6 months from the start of the war or 5 months, I guess, from the start of the war until when offensive operations started, instead of activating the Merchant Marine, the Defense Department put out a worldwide request for proposals for charters for commercially available vehicles. Once again, in times of national security, the Jones Act has to be avoided in order to find the ships that are actually needed when they're needed and are able to perform the functions that we need them to. And so even though the Defense Department had a preference for American ships, only a dozen, 32 actually, I think is the number, only 32 American-owned ships participated, privately owned commercial American transport ships, participated in the sea lift effort for Operation Desert Storm and Desert Shield and Desert Storm, and none of those were in the Jones Act fleet. Instead, almost all of the assets that were used were either owned by the U.S. government or were foreign ships with oftentimes foreign crews. Now, the reason that the Defense Department, the only reason that I can think of that the Defense Department would have to still defend the Jones Act is that within the Mariners program, there are 4,000 or 5,000 mariners enrolled that can be called upon to crew ships, even foreign ships, that are used in case of national emergency. If we need them, if we can't, if the ready reserve force is not enough. But I mean, it would be. I would be in favor, and I'm sure Senator Lee would be in favor of just giving the Defense Department all the money it needs to hire double that number of mariners and train them and keep them on standby. It would be much cheaper than maintaining than to maintain a force of 4,000 or 5,000 mariners in a merchant marine that has been obsolete for decades. And so for the Navy, it's just 4,000 free guys, and so they're not going to argue against it. But if they had the choice between 4,000 free guys that they can call on in the merchant marine and actually being able to specially train a force that they're going to need in case of any eventuality, I promise you that they would choose the latter.
John asks, would COVID-19 be an emergency that allows the president to waive the Jones Act?
Any emergency would qualify as an emergency that would allow the president to waive the Jones Act. For example, when Hurricane Katrina happened, there were foreign governments that, without even asking us, rushed emergency relief supplies to New Orleans to save people, and the Jones Act was, and the Jones Act proved a problem then too. I mean, the Jones Act is an amazing thing. It's something that we have for cases of national emergency, and every time we have a national emergency, it has to be waived, right? So I don't know if the COVID-19 is such a pervasive pandemic. It's not like an earthquake or a hurricane. And so I think that the justification of using the Jones Act would be that we've now had the worst quarter of we've had the greatest single quarter loss of economic activity in the history of economic statistics, worse than any quarter in the Great Depression. And so the need to get this economy jump-started again is increasingly desperate and urgent. And for that reason, COVID could provide the president a justification with just a broad-based effort to release the economy from all of these shackles that are keeping it down. And this is certainly a case where it would have a great effect, because right now, like I said, there is no the coastal trade that we have is minimal. It's been shut down. It's not being protected for Americans. It's being prohibited for Americans. And so being able to unleash that trade might even lead to a renaissance of the shipbuilding industry, and to a renaissance even for the mariners' unions and the shipbuilding industry's own unions, which would see their membership swell if we could compete on a level playing field. It's like Governor Scott Walker used to say of Wisconsin farmers, even though Wisconsin farmers benefit greatly from the farm program. Our workers are the best workers in the world. They can outcompete anybody. No matter what the differential in labor cost, they are the most competitive, most productive workforce on earth. And so they don't need anything like the Jones Act to protect them.
We've got a question from Bob, just for a discussion. Could you walk us through the consequences of opening the Panama Canal and the significance of the Jones Act prohibitions? How do those two elements work together?
Well, that's a complicated question. I'll just point out one, and without pretending to be able to give a comprehensive answer, I'll just point one thing out. The Jones Act, I assume he's referring to the deepening of the Panama Canal to allow super containers to move through it. These super containers, the super containers are predominantly of South Korean manufacture, Japanese manufacture, and Chinese manufacture. The expansion of the Panama Canal, the deepening of the Panama Canal to be able to accommodate these ships, has been financed substantially by China. And the United States can't compete against these super tankers because, as a result of the Jones Act, the United States doesn't have any super tankers. It doesn't have any capacity to make super tankers or these big super containers. And so the Chinese have been investing in this capacity expansion to be able to have an even more dominant presence on the foreign trade. And it's important for people to understand that this is the critical design flaw of the Jones Act. While preventing foreign competition on America's domestic trade, it doesn't prevent American consumers or American producers from switching to exports and imports. Because the Jones Act, there's no law that prevents foreign competition on foreign routes. And so all of that demand, all of that supply from the producers and demand from American consumers gets channeled from what would be domestic coastal trade into exports and imports. And so in a sense, the Chinese are expanding the Panama Canal in order to take advantage of the opportunity that the Jones Act gives China, right? To be able to capture demand, to be able to capture supply, to be able to replace supply that would otherwise be domestic, but because the Jones Act makes the domestic trade, prohibits the domestic trade, it gives an opportunity for countries like China and South Korea to step in.
We've got a couple of questions about politics here, and I know you've been very critical using terms like selling out, swampy, of some of the members of Congress. I'm not at all arguing that it might not be warranted, but it appears, I'm trying to wrap some of these questions together. It appears with the delegation from Hawaii and Alaska, the delegation from Texas that has the energy producers that need refining capacity, the refining capacity represented by delegations in the Northeast, which we all know there are several states. We have the makings of a pretty formidable contingent, at least in the United States Senate, if not in the United States House of Representatives. What is it that's keeping the momentum from building? I take the senator's point. Some of these issues are eye-glazing. They can be boring. They can be tough. But that seems to me an insufficient answer. If there are enough local interests, we should see more politicians coming to this. And there's a barrier that we're not naming. What is the political barrier that you see?
Well, unfortunately, as I show today, for example, in my article today at National Review, all of the ways in which the Jones Act impacts the energy industry, both the suppliers and the refiners and so forth, almost all of them result in higher unit costs. But because the higher unit costs are structural and sectoral, they just get passed on to consumers. And so consumers are paying, there's, half a dozen ways I can think of off the top of my head in which the Jones Act raises the cost of gasoline for consumers. And so ultimately, it's no skin off the cost of these super majors, as we've seen in many other situations at CEI, and many fellows at CEI can testify to this, and you yourself. These big corporations are agnostic oftentimes to heavy regulations because they're much better able to absorb them. They just pass the costs on to consumers, and the heavy regulations are a barrier to entry from smaller competitors. So oftentimes
let me pause you there for a moment, Mario, because I'm not sure that's always the case. I mean, you made reference earlier, and there's some data that you've written about. The additional cost because of the Jones Act to a barrel of oil that gets shipped from Texas from either New England or up to Canada, it's a few dollars. But that works out where the price of oil is today. I mean, that could be $3 is more than 10%. We're talking 12, 15% of a barrel of oil. And so it makes it entirely uneconomical for those Texas producers. It's not just that they can pass it on.
That's right. And
I'm looking for the Texas contingent, the Oklahoma contingent.
Right.
Where are these politicians? Why are they missing in action?
Right. And I'm looking for that as well. And I think the answer there, and those producers are materially affected, and they cannot pass the costs on. I mean, Texas producers are facing bankruptcy because their ability to sell their product is restricted. And you're right. And I would say that it's just a matter of the fact that these that it's much easier. I mean, anybody who's been on congressional staff knows that it's much easier to kill an act of Congress than to get one enacted. And so all you need to have is sufficient opposition to something like Senator Lee's proposals for reforms. And the people who are on the sidelines, or maybe even the Texas delegation, will not get into it because they're afraid of what the consequences could be. And so, but it's a matter of, I mean, I think the task for us at CEI and for our supporters and for those who want to help is to help Senator Lee, Senator Cruz. I'm sure there's no daylight between Senator Cruz and Senator Lee on this issue, to help those members of Congress who are willing to do the right thing on the Jones Act build the coalition that's necessary, including the special interests that are, that are in favor of Jones Act reform, and to build the coalition that's necessary to finally start passing these long-needed reforms.
Now, if we were doing a book forum, Mario, I would have led with the question, what is it you most want the audience to know about your book? Unfortunately for you, our next book forum isn't until next week. It is not today. But I will give you a reprieve and ask, what is it, as a closing thought, you most want people to take away about this subject? What is it that people need to know about the Jones Act?
Yeah, so I mean, look, it's a very, it pulls at the heartstrings, especially now. We all want to protect America's workers. This law does not protect America's workers. It's not a policy of America first. It's a policy of America last. And this becomes obvious if you just take an honest look at the purposes for which the law was passed in the first place. It was passed, and this is what it says, this says it right in the law, it was passed to advance American commerce, to protect America's shipbuilding industry, and to keep America prepared for times of war and national emergency. All you have to do is go through each of those and ask the honest question, has it served those purposes? And there is no doubt, I mean, the data is overwhelming over the past 100 years, that it penalizes domestic trade and favors exports and imports. It has ruined America's ocean-going shipbuilding industry. We're down to just a few decrepit shipyards. And it's been militarily obsolete for decades. And every time there's a national emergency, it has to be waived. And so I think that Rover next door totally agrees with me, as you can hear. And so that's what I would leave people with. This law does not serve its purposes. It undermines its purposes. And even its beneficiaries and the lobbyists that they're wasting their money on in Congress are being hurt by it in the long run.
Very good. Thank you. This has been a very helpful conversation. I learned a lot going through your paper, your study last month. I appreciate the work that you're doing for us at CEI. It looks like calling in today from Illinois. So thank you for that also. I want to remind everybody we are doing this as a series. So the Repeal for Resilience Zoom seminars are ongoing. Stay tuned to your email so you can see invitations for the ones that are coming up in August. The next event we have scheduled is next week, August 6th. I'll be joined by Ian Murray and Kevin Williamson. Will do the honors of interviewing Ian. Kevin of National Review will talk to Ian about his recently released book, The Socialist Temptation. It came out just 2 days ago, and it's received quite a bit of fanfare already. So I'm looking forward to that conversation. Hope you'll be able to join us. To all of you, thanks for being part of what we do here at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. I look forward to seeing you, if not on Zoom, back in person soon. Very good.
Thank you, Ken.